Hi guys, so welcome to Subu Medicine, and this is Immunology. So today we're going to discuss about the bigger or general concept of the immunology, and after that we'll go very detailed about it. All right, so you guys hear this term, right? You're immune to something. Like, what does that mean? So let's define what immunity means. All right, whenever you guys hear, let's use this term. You guys hear this immunity, right? Or always think about resistance or defense to any sort of foreign substance, any infection. So whenever we say we're immune to something, we're talking about we are resistant to that infections or to that foreign substance, all right? And if you often hear terms like immunocompromise, which means that you are immune, the resistance that fight for an infection, that has been compromised. So now you're more susceptible to get that pathogens or virus, right? And that is immune, right? So we can think about this as a, let's say, resistance to an infections, all right? Now, then after that, we also have to talk about like, what is the immune system means, all right? So whenever we talk about the immune systems, immune system is, we're talking about systems. So the collections of the tissues or organs or mediators that is responding and providing resistance to fight for infection. So together whole, we call them a immune system. So we can say we'll just say collections of tissues, like cells, right? Like any sort of mediators, and then how these mediators are responding, we'll just write on responding, okay? And like fighting for an infection. That is what basically immune system means. Now, after this, what are we doing here? What is this class? This is immunology, right? Think about immune. Immune, we just described resistance, collections of cells that is providing and fighting for infections, all right? And we are doing what? We're just studying of that. So that's what basically immunology means. Immune, this is what immune basically means, and logy means study, right? So logos means study. So we're studying of the collections of the cells or mediators that is providing a resistance or defense mechanism to fight for any sort of like pathogens, foreign substance, anything that is that sort of contributes or that provides or that causes any harmful to our body, all right? And that those causes, all right, that's going to be harmful. But then what our immune system does is that it protects against those foreign substances, all right? Now, after this, all right, usually, whenever we talk about these immune systems, these immune systems, we usually divide these immune systems into two parts, all right? So let's try it. And what are those parts? First, we call them, all right? We call them, this is innate. Innate immune system, write down innate immune system, all right? And the other one we call them, all right, I'll write it in a different color here, all right, a blue this time. And other one we call them adaptive. Okay, this is adaptive. So this adaptive immune systems. All right, so basically you have innate immune system and you have adaptive immune system, right? So this is going to be adaptive immune system, right? So that's how it's spelled. So innate, and what is the difference between innate and adaptive? That's something you have to remember. Whenever we think about innate, think always about, before the birth. It is already present within yourself, okay? And you sort of like, you have it and you still have it before the birth. Acquired or adaptive, which basically, this is also called acquired, all right? Which basically means is that, you got exposed to something and you made sort of like antibodies against that particular pathogens, right? So you adapt that special infections or specific infections, all right? So because of that, all right, you adapt to that specific pathogens or bacteria or foreign substance. We call them adaptive immune systems. So we usually, immune system is usually referring to as like this portion, which is we're going to talk about it. This usually includes like B cells and T cells. We'll talk about that, all right? Now, what is this innate immune systems? Okay, before the birth, all right, it is within yourself, and these are, okay, we also call them, these are very non-specific, all right? Non-specific, meaning that the way they fight for the infections is if the bacteria come or pathogens, a virus, is a similar pattern. That's how they protect, or that's how they provide resistance, or that's how they provide defense mechanism to fight for infection. They are not specific to like a particular pathogens or a bacteria, right? That's why we call them, these are non-specific immune systems, right? This one we call them as a specific immune systems because it is, it can make an antibodies, or it can, whenever it get exposed to certain particles, it can make antibodies against to fight for that. That's what we call them. These are very, very specific immune systems, right? This is one of the main difference between the innate and then adaptive immune systems, or these are also called acquired immune systems, right? And also, like, these guys also have like, the adaptive immune system, they show something called diversity. What does that mean? Oh, let's write down here. Diversity. And these ones are very limited diversity, right? What does this mean? Which basically means that, okay, because look, these guys, diversity is based on the receptors that are located on this immune systems. What that means is that, the cells that fight for our infections, they have to somehow recognize it, right? The capability of recognizing, all right, this innate immune systems, has certain receptors, like limited amount of receptors, or which can recognize, okay, only limited portions or they have a limited way of recognizing. But this one, it has much more higher diversity because it can recognize any pathogens, so that way it can, it can react into it, or it can provide resistance. That's why we call them, there's diversity is present on the adaptive immune systems, and innate immune systems is limited. You guys will know more about it when we talk about cells, all right? And not only this, right, guys, there is something called, like, what is also happening here is that, these guys, there's something called the idea of what is happening here. This guy, they do something called clonal expansion. What does that mean? All right? And they do not. No clonal expansion right here. All right? What does this mean? It's a very important concept here, all right? The point here you have to remember here is that, let's say this is my pathogen right here, all right? This pathogen. It got into our body, all right? And what is going to happen here is that, this is a cell right here, all right? This is our immune cell. Let's say we can say this, let's say B cell, all right? It's one of the cells. What happens is that, these guys have like the antibodies, like these are like these, what is this called? There's this bunch of this receptor there, right? Remember, what happens is that if my B cells will make like antibodies, so let's say this is my antibodies, right? So let's say this is my antibodies. B cell will make plasma cells and plasma cell will make antibodies. Let's say if this antibodies is able to recognize the receptors. If the antibodies is able to recognize the receptor, okay, on the bacteria, we call them an antigens, all right? So what is an antigens? So whenever, let's say, there's a recognitions of these receptors, okay, that's what's called antibodies. And then let's say, if these guys is able to, like, or site where these receptors are located, we call them an epitope, right? So that's the difference between epitope and antigens. Epitope basically means is that there's a locations of where these receptors are present, where the antibodies can bind into it, all right? And this receptor that's showing all this kind of stuff, right? This guys, right? Where the lymphocytes can bind. Okay, we call them an antigens, all right? So now, what is going to happen here is that if this guys, all right? So if this, because these are, look, this could be, let's say this is X, Y, this is B, okay, this is A, let's say this is B. The different types of these receptors are there, right? So what happens is that, and they're like, let's say, maybe this is 1, this is 2. What is going to happen here is that, there are, let's say, small amount of this B cells, or let's say plasma cells, okay? What is going to happen here is that these B cells, this one, they can actually multiply, all right? They can multiply, make a progeny of this, and then they can actually, make a clone out of it, so that way they can bind to all the receptor, okay? Because this could be A, this could be B, this could be C, D, all of them. They have these varieties of this, right? So you need to have a varieties of this receptor in order to properly bind into this, like bacteria receptors, so that way, it can destroy this, right? So in order to do that, what is going to happen here is that the B cells also have to make like a lot of these receptors, all right? A lot of these receptors in order to bind into it, all right? So this is and this is a general concept here. We'll go very detailed about what these receptors and all that also, all right? So in order to bind, and in order to bind this, there has to be a bunch of these receptors, right? So because of that, so what is this? They can make a lot of this. So these receptors, which can go and bind into this is what is called clonal expansions, right? Basically, they're making a clone out of it in order to match all of this. All right, so this is what is called clonal expansions, and these are usually the lymphocytes do that, all right? Because usually when we talk about adaptive immune system, let's talk about this. Whenever we talk about adaptive immune system, we are talking about the lymphocytes, okay? Let's write down here. Lymphocytes, and you know those lymphocytes are? Those lymphocytes are, let's write down here. These are B cells and then T cells, all right? Those lymphocytes are B cells and T cells, all right? Very, very important, okay? These are very, very important cells. And the B cells is the one that's going to make plasma bodies, and which is going to make antibodies or plasma cells. And the T cells are those cytotoxic cells or the T helper cells. We'll talk about those too, right? And then whenever we talk about innate immune systems, we have to even divide innate immune system two things, okay? First, let's write down here. One, we have to talk about the physical barrier, okay? That is the first defense mechanisms, all right? First barrier for any sort of like a bacterial infections, and then second, there is another second line of like a barrier, or we can call them an anatomical barrier, and there is a third line of barrier, okay? And usually here we can say this is an internal barrier, right? Internal barrier, and basically our internal resistance that is providing for any sort of infections or foreign substance. Whenever we talk about physical barrier, this is where we talk about our skin, because remember, in order to get to our organs, it has to pass through our skins, right? So this is our skin is playing as a physical barrier, because look, we have what? Non-keratinized epithelium tissue, right? And that, it's keratinized. So, it is very difficult for any sort of like bacteria to get into it. So usually what needs to happen is if there's injuries or cut, okay, then bacteria can get into easier. And other thing is that, okay, pH also, the pH of the skin. Remember, pH of the skin is slightly acidic, and you want to maintain that, because if your pH is become more alkaline because you started using a different type of soap, then what is going to happen is that your pH becomes more alkaline, and that can disturbs the pH levels, and then when pH are more alkaline, then bacteria can easily pass through. That's the reason why it is really important that what kind of soap or what kind of shampoos that you guys are using, right? That's really important there, all right? And then in here, we also have to talk about, look, we'll talk about this more in this picture right here. But then now, just know this, okay? So this is where the physical barrier comes in. And the second line of barrier is also, remember, if it needs to go to brain, it has to pass through the blood-brain barrier, all right? There's also that we have to remember that. And then internal barrier, this is where, we talk about all these white blood cells, okay? All the white blood cells. But except from your B cells and T cells, all the white cells, like for instance, okay, we'll write it down here. Neutrophils, all right? Neutrophils, there's what? There's eosinophil, all right? And where is this coming from? They're coming from bone marrow, right? And I've already discussed that in bone marrow lecture of how these guys are synthesized. And there's a basophil, all right? And there's this natural killer cell too, all right? And then obviously interferon, you don't want to forget that, all right? And then obviously you have eosinophil, basophil, and macrophages. You don't want to forget that, all right? All of them, they're classified as a WBC, and these are the part of the innate immune systems. Even there's a complementary protein too, all right? This is also classified as a innate immune system. Remember, there's a way. First, they need to pass through this first line of barrier. Then they have to. Then after that, if they were able to pass through this first line of barrier, then they'll have internal barrier where they'll able to meet with this guys right here, our WBC, white blood cells. And the reason why we call them white blood cells is because they don't have a hemoglobin there, right? So they look white. So that's why we call them white blood cells, all right? That's how you differ that white blood cells from red blood cells, all right? And then whenever we talk about, let's say, adaptive immune system, we talk about the B cells and T cells, right? These are lymphocytes. B cells and T cells are lymphocytes. And these guys are, like, basically, these guys, the neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, these guys are part of what? These guys are part of the myeloid series of the bone marrow house, all right? And remember, usually what do we do? These guys, okay, we'll talk about it over there, all right, right here. Let's talk about right here. Whenever we talk about, let's say, this WBC, okay, usually WBC, we can divide this WBC in a couple of parts. One, we can call them as this is a granulocytes, okay? Why we call them a granulocytes is because they contain granules, and other one is called agranulocytes, okay? Because they don't contain granules, okay? Because granules is the one they have this enzyme rich, all right? And what do we have in here in granulocytes here? This is where we have okay? Look, I'm gonna draw this right here. What is this? Like neutrophils right here. It's a very important concept. These are neutrophils, and if you see this structure right here, look, this structure, it looks like, look, it has a bunch of these granules, like primary, secondary, like tertiary granules, okay? And these are granules, and because they're called neutrals, because they can take both acidophil and also they can take basic dye, okay? So it kind of looks something like this, all right? These are also called polymorpho, okay, nuclear leukocytes. They're also called, because they're multi-lobed nuclei. Remember, these neutrophils, they're small, but they're abundantly present in your circulatory systems, all right? And these are very, very important for fighting for infections, all right? These are also called the micropolicements, all right? And this is a granulocytes, right? And then if you look at this, what is this structure right here? Look, this is, okay, we'll just make from here, right here. This is if you look at this, it's a bilobe structure, and you're taking eosinophil dye, and we call this as let's say this is eosinophil, all right? Eosinophil. And what is the importance of eosinophil? Guys, the eosinophils are very, very important for, like, secreting. It's very important during the allergic reaction. Let me write down here, allergic reaction, okay? And also fighting for like a long parasite, like helminth, because they can produce something called histamine. Okay? And then one more structure here. What is this? These are called basophil. All right? And basophils respond to the allergic reactions. And what do they produce? Importance of these granules, what do they contain? Okay, they contain, okay, right here, write down, histamine. All right? And histamines are used for vasodilators. And not only this, they also produce serotonin and then heparin. All right? Heparins are anticoagulant, right? And so these threes, all right, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, these threes, okay, we call them granulocytes, okay, because they contain these granules, all right? And remember, the basophils, we call them basophils is because they take the basic dye. One of the important features of basophil is that when they are circulating, we call these guys a basophil, but as soon as when they move to tissue, we call them mast cells. So remember that basophils is the same as basophils, and mast cells are not much different. Basophils are called mast cells when these basophils are on the tissue, all right? And whenever we talk about this, let's say agranulocytes, this is what we talk about. Look, we're talking about, what is this guy right here? This is a monocyte right here, okay? Monocyte. It's very important because this monocyte is important. Whenever these guys are circulating, okay, then we call them a monocyte. But as soon as when they go to the tissue, they become macrophages, right? And there are types of macrophages. There are residential macrophages, right? And there are wandering macrophages, right? The residential macrophages, we'll talk about this, right? And then we have other site, which is these granulocytes, look right down here. And these are called, look at the down here. These are called lymphocytes, all right? And lymphocytes, whenever we talk about lymphocytes, all right, These are usually B cells and T cells, right? So I can simply say this is my T cells right here, and this is B cells, right? So now look at this important concept right here. This neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil, all right? This monocytes, macrophages, right? Even the natural killer cells right here, all right? Natural killer cells. Okay, we'll make this as natural killer cells. Okay, all of them, okay, belongs to the innate immune systems, okay? But your T cells and B cells, these guys belong to the adaptive immune systems, all right? These belongs to the adaptive immune system. And you need to be able to know that, all right? Now, if you come here, right here, okay? So, we're talking about this adaptive immune system, the innate immune system, and we're trying to, distinguish, or we're trying to find the differences also, okay? One more thing that I do want to talk about quickly here is that whenever you guys talk about the adaptive immune systems, okay, usually these adaptive immune systems are divided into two parts, okay? Let me put it down here. Let me write down here, right? Right here, adaptive immune systems, okay? What happens is that they call these as, all right, two parts. One is called, let's say, active immune systems, or active adaptive immune systems, and another one is a passive immune systems, okay? And whenever we talk about active, there's a further, these actives are divided into two parts, all right? One is called natural, and we'll talk about what this means, and the other one is artificial. Same thing with this one, passive. You have a native or natural, let's say, not native, it's called natural. Another one is called artificial. What does this mean, all right? And we're talking this adaptive. Okay, this active, remember we said that usually this adaptive immune system is referring as, all right, that when they get exposed to some virus or any bacteria or any pathogen, they'll make what? They'll make antibodies against it, right? So, and who's are doing? This is doing, lymphocytes are doing. And lymphocytes are part of what? Adaptive immune system, a specific immune system, they're acquired immune systems, right? So, let's say if there's a pathogen comes in, right? Then when the pathogen comes, what happens is that our lymphocytes, B cells will make an antibodies against it, right? And who is making that? You are making that, right? So that means it's you yourself is making that. So because yourself making that, we call them as a natural way of making. So that's why we say it's a natural active immune systems. Okay? It's a natural way of making that, right? Now, whenever we say artificial is also, what is difference? Artificial is also, what happens like you purposefully you give, like for example, a vaccine. Usually these are examples like vaccinations, right? What happens when you give a vaccinations? What is that? You make an antibodies against it, and but you are giving something, right? Artificially, you're giving something, and who is making the antibody? Yourself. Okay, so that's why the vaccinations are considered as artificial, but they are part of the active immune system. Now, what active is that? Just always think about who is making the antibodies. If you yourself is making antibodies against something, then usually they're part of the active. And then natural is that virus or bacteria, you didn't inject bacteria viruses to yourself, I guess, right? So what happens? Whenever you got exposed to that, the natural way for your body to make antibodies, that is what's called natural, okay? And then whenever we say passive, think about passive as, you did not use energy to make it. Like active, like what? You use energy to make it, right? Your body used it to make it. Passive, you didn't use it. Meaning that, for example, natural way would be like, for example, breastfeeding is a very important one. Like breastfeeding for your baby, right? Usually, the baby or the mother's milk provides us immunity for babies to fight for infection, okay? But how she made it, naturally she made it, and she's providing through breastfeeding, okay? So that is a part of the natural way of passive immune systems, passive adaptive immune systems. And other one is artificial too. And this is what basically means is that, okay, this is usually for the immunoglobulins, or let's say plasma. We'll just use the plasma for our case, okay? Which basically means is that, let's say you got exposed to a virus, okay? Let's say coronavirus, COVID-19. And what happens is that, you often probably are hearing that, that people who got exposed and got cured, they have an antibodies, right? So a person's, who hasn't got infected, or, what you could do is you could do a plasma transfusions, okay, from someone else's antibodies and give it to some other, okay? So the artificial basically it is transfusing your plasma or immunoglobulins, like for instance, let's say I made antibodies, but then my antibodies, was transmitted to someone else body to fight for infections, okay? So that is an artificial way of doing it, and it still is a passive, because the persons who got antibodies, that person's body did not make that antibody, okay? So this is the concept of the active and passive immune system. Even though, remember, these adaptive immune systems, if you want to be very, very clear, okay, these adaptive immune systems are categorized as, two main parts. One is called humoral immune systems, and other one is called like a cell-mediated immune systems, okay? And this active and passives are part of the humoral immune systems. And when we talk about the B cells, we'll talk about very detail about this, all right? Now after this, okay? After this, we know this, we did general concept of this, right? So we said that innate immune systems, okay, it has a further divisions like, okay, your physical barriers, then you have this, all these white blood cells, okay? And after this, what is going to happen here is that there is the third line of defense, or third line of resistance is your lymphocytes, okay? So first line is always going to be a physical, anatomical barrier, chemical barrier, those are first line, okay? Second line of barrier, like anatomic barrier, like for example, blood-brain barrier. Your testis barrier, right? Those ones, the blood testis barrier, those ones, all right? And then your internal barriers are going to be your WBCs, white blood cells, all right? And then you have the last one, okay? And those are the lymphocytes, all right? Now let's talk about this physical barrier first, okay? Let's say in order for the bacteria or pathogen to get into our systems, right? What happens? First, it needs to go to this skin, right? It needs to go to the skin. I could have skin injured. If my skin is injured, let me say, let's say my skin is injured. If my skin is injured, let's say this pathogen, right? This pathogen can easily come in, all right? So it easily can come in, any bacteria, any pathogen. So that's why, okay, the skin is a very protective layer for us. It is providing an anatomical barrier, all right? That's what it is. Skin, and also, as I said, the pH of the skin is just slightly acidic, right? Those are very, very important, because what is this pH of skin is doing? Because if the skins are very slightly acidic, what is that going to lead you into is that it is not, the bacteria would not able to survive in a very acidic conditions and acidic environment, so they'll die, okay? So that's how these guys are providing like barrier, right? Not only this, even your, like for example, there's a normal flora in your skins. They also provide resistance for any bacteria to get into. But if there's injured or cut, then bacteria or viruses are more susceptible to get inside, or any foreign substances, right? Or allergic stuff too. And so skin is there. What about other one? Like for example, your nostril right here. There's listed this many. You have, what do you call the nasal hair? That is also providing barrier for you, right? The mucous membrane, let's write down here, okay? Mucous membrane, they're also providing barrier. And if you look at this bronchi, what is this bronchi called? They have this something called like cilia, right? Columnar epithelium cilia. If you guys remember respiratory system, you have a cilia, like a cilia escalator, right? If I make this, okay, if I make this like a one cells right here, and they have this like, like cilia right here, like up like this, and these guys are provide what? Removing any dust particles and all that kind of stuff, right? So they also provide a barrier. So this is cilia, let's say escalator. We'll write down escalator, all right? And remember, what is this? There's a lung, right? In the lungs, what do you have this? Like proteins, like for example, like dust cell, not dust cell, sorry, that's because that's innate immune system. But here there are different types of like chemical stuff, like for example, surfactant, okay? Surfactant, or even like those defense proteins, all right? These guys are very important, all right? These are chemical barrier also that. Even tears, all right? Tears, or not only that, even if you let's say saliva right here, okay? Saliva has what? Like those lysozymes, enzymes, all right? These guys, okay, we talked about physical barriers, like skins, nasal layer, mucous membranes, all right? But the chemical barrier, like lysozymes, all right? Like surfactant, defenses, okay, proteins. These guys also play a role in what? Or providing, or their resistance to any sort of like a bacteria and viruses, right? And not only this, look, this is my stomach right? Stomach produces what? HCl, right? This is very important because this hydrochloric acid is very important for what? For maintaining, making the stomach very acidic, right? So whenever your stomach is acidic, what is going to happen is that there is no way the bacteria can survive there. It's a very important concept here, right? So this is why, okay? So always remember that. These guys are always like providing all these things I just talked about. They're providing your first line of defense or first line of resistance for any sort of like foreign materials, bacteria, infection, allergens, anything, all right? So anything that disturbs on here, let's say a pH or let's say the hydrochloric acid, if you give it drugs like for example proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole for a longer period of time, it can disturb this and it can disturb the pH. Then bacteria are more susceptible to, grow in your stomach, and you don't want that to happen. And nasal hair, or like for example, your stratified, keratinized, stratified squamous epitheliums in the skins, using like different types of soap or like shampoo, and that, that disturbs the pH. That makes the pH more alkaline. Then what happens? The viruses and all the substances are more susceptible to get into it, right? So remember, you gotta always remember that, somehow there has to be, the virus, if they wanna get into our tissue, they need to pass this first, okay? This anatomical, chemical barriers, okay? Before they get to our internal line of this resistance, which are our WBC, which are our white blood cells, right? So that is something that you have to remember.